Welcome to the Culture Stew podcast. I'm Maria Morukian.
And I'm Roger Moreano.
In every episode, we will meet with practitioners, authors, and all around fascinating people who share their wisdom and insights on all things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Hello, Roger Moreano.
Hello, Maria. How's it going?
It's good. I can't believe it's our last podcast episode of the season. That just flew.
Yeah, and what a season of great guests we've had, just a full range of folks with a variety of different backgrounds and just powerful testimonies, and just really, really a fun season to be a part of.
Absolutely. Yes. There's many highlights to share with folks in between now and season 6.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of what came up in what I heard from our guests kind of reflects some of the stuff I continue to see from colleagues and DEI practitioners in higher ed and in corporate spaces and so forth, especially when I, see what's being put out there on social media and other ways that folks are connecting and really communicating some themes that I think are pretty consistent and important for us to pay attention to. I think some of these themes include the exhaustion that we feel, right? I think sense of despair, perhaps, that we feel in terms of how much pushback has been happening both in the legal and political worlds and in just our everyday lives. Hearing from close friends of mine who are from Black and Brown communities talking about how exhausting it is to have to continue to fight the same battles and explain to folks over and over again that, yes, the issues that we are describing are real. They are actually impacting communities and individuals. And, I'm just hoping that as we move forward, and I know we're going to talk about opportunities to connect and really forge strong relationships professionally in ways that we can help support communities. But I just hope that we can really sustain one another and really communicate to one another that this work matters, that the efforts that you're putting in are not in vain, and through a real intentional effort to take care of ourselves and to take care of one another and to not feel like you have to do this alone, we will prevail. History shows over and over again that when these pushbacks happen, it's our insistence on making it go in a positive direction and, building community and being in community with one another that pushes us through. So I just see that consistently happening. And I want to make sure that folks out there hear that we see you, we hear you, we also are experiencing similar types of moments, and we're going to prevail.
Yeah, what is that quote, the MLK quote, that the arc of history is long but bends toward justice?
Yeah.
Sometimes it can feel so long.
Yeah.
And that's why, we decided to dedicate today's conversation to talking about that, right? Having some frank conversations about some of these barriers and what, just kind of expressing how it feels. But then to your point, what can the future hold for us? How can we sustain ourselves and one another, knowing that it's always going to get harder before it gets easier. And maybe this work never becomes easier, right? It's just, we are always going to be finding ourselves challenged. We're always going to be finding ourselves pushing against systems that want to keep inequality in place.
Yeah, freedom is a constant struggle, and Angela Davis and others have reminded us of that all the time. And I think I've shared this story in the past where, as a younger professional, I was once interviewed for a newsletter and stated that I wish that, my DEI work will be obsolete in 50 years, and that to me, was well-intentioned, but very much naive in terms of understanding that as long as we are all participants in and, involved in systems of competition, systems that, push winning over another, whether it be economically, politically, or what have you, there will be those who abuse the systems and will take advantage of folks who are disadvantaged in many ways. And so we have to always do the work, and every new generation will have its challenge. And, I'm quite inspired, obviously, by my children and their generation and what they're doing to push for racial justice, environmental justice, and on and on and on. So we are all part of this because we choose to be, and I wouldn't have it any other way, even in the struggle. So looking forward to what's to come, because I know people will dig in and really support one another, and I think it's going to move in a positive direction soon.
Yeah. You were mentioning the conversations that we've been having with other professionals and practitioners just around this level of fatigue. And I recently spoke at a conference about this, and I've been using the analogy of the wall that endurance runners experience, usually, about 20 miles in to, a marathon or whatever the case may be. But I think it bears a lot. There's a lot of connection, right? So when we think about what the wall is, it's literally when our bodies just become absolutely empty of any fuel, right? We literally run out of energy, and we hit this proverbial wall where our body just slows down. Our legs sometimes feel really heavy. We can't catch our breath. Sometimes our vision gets blurry. And it's just this moment of such frustration, because mentally we want to go on and we've been training for this, but our body is not permitting us to go forward. And I've experienced this, and I think that's why it resonates with me as a runner, is that I've had that where I'm like, I did the training. I prepared myself. What is going on? How, why, and how do I overcome this? And when you look at what coaches say in terms of what causes us to hit the wall, it's actually very similar to what we experience as DEI practitioners, right? Sometimes it's related to, we've just set unrealistic goals for ourselves, or somebody else has set unrealistic goals for us, particularly when we think about just the pressure that is put on often the shoulders of that one person who's the DEI person for an organization, or the one consultant who feels like, I have to solve this issue for all of my clients, right? That we set ourselves up sometimes for failure because we take on this responsibility to conquer racism, right? To overcome oppression in a short amount of time, and it's not realistic. And so we kind of set ourselves up. Also, poor pacing is something that can cause us to hit the wall, right? And when we think about, did I start the race too quickly, right? Did I try to put myself into there? When you run a distance run, there are pace groups, and so based on where people have trained and what their capacity is, they are in a particular pace group. And there's everything from the super fast elite athletes who are probably going to be the first folks to cross the finish line, all the way to the folks that are just hey, I'm here to walk, maybe jog a little bit, but I'm going to take my time, and everyone in between. And when we find ourselves in the wrong pace group, we can sometimes burn out if we're trying to keep at a pace that is too fast for us, or if we're stuck in a pace that's too slow for what we've trained for. We can find ourselves really frustrated and impatient, like, this isn't working for me. We're not making change fast enough. And I think about that in terms of our DEI work, and how often we find ourselves feeling frustrated, either because we feel like, I don't have the tools to be able to move at the pace that I feel like I need to, or my organization wants me to, or we're moving too slow. We've been having the same conversation over and over. We keep getting caught up in the weeds. We need to make more progress. And so I don't know, does that resonate in terms of that disconnect with the pacing?
Absolutely, yeah. And you could use multiple physical pursuit analogies for that, but running is a perfect one. And it actually made me think about how another analogy to use running as a metaphor is the reality that some folks jump in and say, you know what, I haven't been exercising in a few years, and I want to jump in and take on a challenge.
Yeah.
And so I want to do a marathon in 8 weeks, right? And so you
Inadequate
jump
training.
in. Yeah. And so you jump in, and all of a sudden, about a week into it, you're
Yeah.
realizing, oh my gosh, I am ill prepared for what I thought
Yeah.
this was. And it makes me think about how many folks, I think with good intentions after George Floyd's murder,
Hmm.
jumped into the DEI space knowing that there was a huge need and not enough practitioners, and
Yeah.
came to the field from other perhaps areas of consulting or practice that are valuable, like leadership and what have you, organizational leadership, but the nuance that was needed to really delve deeply into and pursue the full marathon of addressing
Hmm.
DEI issues and deep issues of inequity within organizations really caught a lot of people off guard, I think, and it probably led to some of the things we've heard about the work not being done well, or perhaps causing even some harm, right? And again,
Yeah.
unintentional, but when we are ill prepared for what is required, and don't know fully what we are jumping into, it could have us hit a wall very, very quickly in that training, and then suddenly be like, all right, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this marathon in 8 weeks. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so good analogy.
Absolutely. Oh yes. The training piece. And even for people who are like you said, who are athletes, right?
Hmm.
In their own right. So even for some of us who perhaps uh, I've seen this a lot, like you said, there are people who are in leadership development or organizational development who say, oh, I could do this DEI thing too.
Right.
But there is a complex and nuanced skill set that's needed. And even for those of us who are in the DEI work, um, there may be instances where we set ourselves up for failure because we're asked to do something that's not in our wheelhouse, and we feel
Yeah.
obligated to take it on, but we don't have the time or the bandwidth to train ourselves up on that particular area of knowledge or expertise, and that can also be really challenging. So yeah, and it just leaves it leaves it causes challenges for us to ensure the vitality of this work, but also to maintain some credibility. And as you said, it can sometimes cause harm, which, again, causes injuries for people. Um,
Yeah.
the other thing is we don't, and you alluded to this earlier, we don't take the time to refuel, right? We wait until we are literally um, falling apart to stop and take a breath. And that is so destructive. And yet I find that almost every person I've talked to who's in this work is falling into that same trap. And when I think about it from, again, the running perspective, I was always told very firmly by my coaches, you don't wait until you're thirsty to drink your water, right? You have to build it in when you're still feeling fresh. You take the breaks, knowing that, there are going to be people passing you, but you still need to take the break. And ultimately, that is going to help you across the finish line. But I think about how often we feel like I can't stop. I can't stop to refuel because I have to keep going. And then we wonder why we hit the wall.
Yeah, no doubt. And even with that analogy, even the kind of the preparation the night before a race, right? And the lead up in terms of
Yes.
your nutrition and energy.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, as we work with clients and work with communities and organizations on these issues, we got to do a lot of legwork ahead of time to not only prepare the material and be familiar with it and understand the concepts and what the goals are, but to really connect with the community that we're a part of, so that we are understanding them and their needs. Instead of just jumping in, not knowing an organization very well, because then it's going to be evident in terms of how it comes across, right? So, yeah, I'm gonna have to pick up my running a little bit more so I can, see these realities show up more consistently for me.
Yeah. And before a big event, like a long run, in the training process, you taper, right? So you do like your intense training earlier in the program so that the final weeks you're sort of tapering down a little bit to give your body a little bit of a rest. And similarly, I think often, and I'm definitely feeling this right now because I have not been tapering. I've been going from one thing to another, to another, to another. And I can feel it that, it causes me to be less present when I do have to show up for an event. And because we're not giving our body time to refuel, to rest. And I think a lot of times we don't realize as DEI practitioners, hey, before you're going to be doing something that's going to take a significant emotional, physical, mental toll, taper, give yourself a break, take a day off, have an admin day, whatever it is that you need. Um, this
Yeah.
is my recommendation for folks to, taper before a big event.
Yeah. And take days off. I think, you mentioned taking off day. I mean, that,
Yeah.
I think there's a badge of honor that sometimes folks communicate in terms of, no
Yes.
off days, right? You're hardcore and I'm going to do this. And it's the same thing, I think, oftentimes in
Mhm.
social justice and DEI work. It could range from folks really seeing that as a badge of honor to folks feeling perhaps a survivor's guilt type of sensation in terms of, if I take a day off, that's a day off that I'm enjoying and taking for myself while others suffer, right? And it's
Yes.
that sense of unfairness and that you need to do more, and understood and understandable. And I know why that feeling is there, because we care deeply, but we have to take care of ourselves to last in this work. And I think what folks sometimes don't understand that are outside of the DEI space, in addition to saying things like those aren't real jobs, which I've heard, over and over again over
Mm.
the years,
I
right? I
love
think there's
that,
an
right? Thank you so
right,
much for
exactly.
invalidating my entire
It's just
career.
not a real job, right? And so but folks probably are unaware of, especially the folks that jumped into DEI recently, how exhausting it is when you deliver material
Yeah.
and you connect, because you're emotionally invested and you're managing the emotions of space. And the exhaustion is not only built there, it's built in the pushback that we get, right? When we get
Yeah.
organizations perhaps that brought us in, that suddenly are pushing back because they suddenly are seeing things that 3 miles down the road that they don't want addressed. And
Hmm.
so that adds to the weight that we feel, the fatigue that we feel, and all of that requires us to take time for ourselves and to really take time off, um, appreciate that we can sustain one another as well by connecting with one another, offering positive affirmations to one another as colleagues, and to remind ourselves that we are, as practitioners, also human beings, that many of us have families, we have children, and we have things that we go through personally that could derail or exhaust us and allow us to not show up as our best from time to time. And we have to acknowledge that, because then the guilt sets in that I didn't show up perfectly all the time and I should have managed my personal stuff better. And then
Yeah.
it's, exhaustion upon exhaustion, right? So it's very difficult work.
So, Roger, you've been in the work for a number of years, right? And we often talk about how this is, this pushback that you were mentioning is part of the cyclical nature of our work, that there is often some sort of catalyst for progress, and then it's followed with pushback and kind of retrenchment and falling back into the status quo. And we keep making progress, we keep edging forward, and yet there's, it's inevitable that every time we see significant and rapid change happen, there's that retrenchment. So what advice do you have for people who are in the space now and trying to figure out how do we keep moving forward? How do we maintain the momentum in this time of pushback? What have you seen work in the past, when you've seen this cycle at play?
Well, the pushback has definitely been very real throughout my career, and I certainly can probably speak on the experiences of folks who I'm close with in this work that have had similar experiences in their careers as well. And it usually follows a pattern where we are brought in to do the work or to start a new role at a campus, and the intention behind it, the communication, is that we want this position to be one where we are advocates for greater equity, advocates for inclusion, advocates for reaching those who are either invisible or minoritized in our communities, in our organizations, or what have you. And as you do the work, that will require really identifying what some of the barriers are. And as barriers are being identified, if those barriers hit too close to home for some folks, then that's where you start seeing a little bit of the pushback. So I've had experiences personally where I've identified some barriers that existed within our own division, for example, and then when that came out, and when I was trying to address it, being called not a team player because I was
Mm,
addressing an issue that it was involving
mhm.
teammates, right? um, I've had situations where you identify opportunities to create centers of inclusion or opportunities for programs of inclusion, and as you do so, the initial buy-in is not there, and you have to really push and push and push. And rally folks together and build coalitions of community members within your organization who are, committed to this, to really add to the voices that really want to push for positive change. And then when the positive change happens, then those who resisted it, often in the leadership circles, then want to take over and decide how that will function and who it will serve, without input from those who it was meant to serve and who were pushing for it in the first place. And so those are very, real barriers, and they show up in way more forms than I've just described, many varieties of forms and ways that, systems continue to not show up well for folks who are underrepresented. And so some of the ways I think that have worked for me, and these are by no means the be all end all, but it's really always being centered on what the end goal is and what the long range objective is. And that is usually and should be rooted in serving the needs of those who will be on the receiving end of those positive changes. So there has to be a consistent communication and a genuine relationship with those who are in need of the types of programs, services, and changes that we are asking for. And so their voices should be at the center. This isn't about us as DEI practitioners. We are vehicles, and we are, sounding boards and amplifiers of the needs of those who need these changes to happen. And so those genuine, authentic, consistently communicated relationships have to always be at the center, because oftentimes communities who are minoritized, whether it be on a college campus or within organizations, already feel isolated and alone and feel like people don't have their backs. So we have to demonstrate through action, not just words, that we have your back. And then that means being allowed a visible and consistent advocate for those changes and needs to the leadership groups or any other folks that are willing and able to affect change within the organization. So for me, that's always been the starting point. Establish and connect on a genuine level, establish those relationships, let folks know that you are committed as an ally and as a supporter. And in the most extreme instances, be willing to risk a little bit of your own professional standing within that organization if it means, moving something forward in a positive way. And I know I've witnessed situations where DEI practitioners, after years of, trying to do the work, decided that this was the time to burn the bridge, because when you burn a bridge in certain instances, it then lights up the community in a way that people can finally see what needs to happen.
Yeah. And it's such a profound risk, right? That I think it's also recognizing who among us can bear the risk of burning the bridge for the sake of others. And I've certainly done that, knowing that I have less to lose in a particular situation than my colleagues do. So if that means that I have to be the one to speak up, to speak out, to deal with the consequences of that, I've done it, and gladly done it. It feels really good sometimes when you can
relate.
You can step forward. But I think that is a very, very individualized and personal choice that people have to make, and to not feel guilt or shame for not burning the bridge if there is too much of a risk, right? A couple of things that I was thinking about too, in terms of how do we strategically move through these cycles of progress and retrenchment. And some things that I've talked about a lot with my clients are, some strategies for momentum. And it all kind of, it's like basic organizational development, right? But when we put that DEI lens onto it, I think that it adds some nuance. It's first and foremost strategy. And you mentioned it, we have to have a clear vision, a compelling vision that feels that everybody can feel a connection to, regardless of their identities. And that when in doubt, we always come back to vision. And that's something that we just heard a couple of days ago from Barbara Love, Dr. Barbara Love, who's done a lot of work in sort of focusing on liberation And she talked about, it always comes back to vision. Every time that we find ourselves sort of struggling or lost or frustrated, what is the outcome that we're striving toward? And then identifying how we can play a role in connecting the DEI vision to the broader organizational vision, mission, and goals, right? It shouldn't be separate. It's got to be something that is just baked into the organizational culture. I think that anybody who's involved in learning and development in particular can play a really important role in the strategy side of DEI, because they have access to everybody across the organization at some given point in time, whether that is, everything from orientation to some of the more kind of baseline mandatory trainings that are done, to events and professional development opportunities. And so I always target my conversations with leaders in training, talent development, learning and development to say, how are you bringing a DEI lens to the entire organizational learning curriculum, right? Not only in terms of who's represented in your graphics, but also how are you reinforcing these concepts? Because the more that we repeat, the more that we just make this a part of our day-to-day, I think the more we can push back against that polarization language that somehow diversity is divisive and equity is inequitable and inclusion is exclusionary. It's like, no, this is something that all of us as human beings should and can find value in and gain from, and everybody wins, right? But those are a couple of things that I think about from the strategy side, and just in terms of like maintaining continuity so that
Right.
the messaging, and it's not superficial messaging, but this is how we communicate what we care about. This is just a part of our day-to-day. This has nothing to do with those, with whatever external forces and changing of the political winds. This is who we are, and it's just a part of what we do on a daily basis. And then the accountability piece, which I think is where a lot of organizations, I don't know if you're experiencing this, but a lot of organizations, I think, struggle with the accountability element of it, right? Everything from the number of times that I hear employees say that they don't have trust that their organization will hold people accountable for exclusionary or bullying or harassing behaviors is really troubling to me, because a lot of times these organizations, they have their, they've got their anti-bullying policies in place, they've got their, their anti-harassment training, but people aren't feeling like it's connecting, right? They don't feel safe going forth and reporting when this is happening, or when they do report it, nothing happens to those folks. So I'm not saying that we have to take a punitive approach to accountability, but somehow we need to be doing a better job in our organizations of establishing expectations of what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and not permitting the brilliant jerks to continue to cause as much harm as they have been.
Yeah, it kind of occurred to me as you were saying that there are so many organizations that are very good at putting out a public perception and image of who they are through their stated values and so forth, and what they are claiming they want to stand for. And you may see that play out in positive ways, in some of the work that they do. But then we often, at least in my experience, hear stories, and I know some of what you described is true with some of the organizations you and I have worked with in the last few years as well. You see some of these dynamics showing up. What's happening behind closed doors? When leaders show up in a very positive and inspiring way in terms of communicating their values and what they stand for, and being against kind of the toxic environments that we see affecting organizations everywhere. And then behind the scenes in their private executive leadership meetings or meetings with boards, the opposite happens. And I've had too many experiences of folks within organizations who are very committed to DEI and also to a healthy organizational culture share that the culture is toxic because of what's happening underneath in the invisible moments within the organization. And that's really one of the toughest nuts to crack, is really getting folks to be able to reflect and see within themselves how they're showing up in every moment as leaders, right? And that, it's not to suggest that we have to be perfect, but it
Mhm.
does really require us to see ourselves as part of the equation in terms of the values that we espouse and want to live out, even in the moments when our emotional intelligence is challenged and we need to, dig in
Right.
and show up better, right? So because those can have negative lasting effects that could really have people within your circle or team question your true commitment, question whether or not you really are invested in this. And so it just made me think about a lot of those instances where I see these organizations talk a good game, but then behind the scenes,
Mhm.
it's toxic.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned emotional intelligence, and I remember reading uh, Resonant Leadership by Richard Boyatzis and Annie McKee, and they talk about the this idea that even the most emotionally intelligent leaders, those who are performing at a high level and sort of and getting a lot from their teams and their organizations are thriving, but when they experience what essentially we've been talking about, the wall, they can, it compromises their ability to tap into their emotional intelligence. Like, this is a finite resource. It's not something that, we gain it and then we keep it. It's something we have to constantly, continue to hone, but we also have to care for ourselves. Otherwise, we can lose our ability to engage in emotionally intelligent behaviors. And that can have a significant impact on not only us and our own health, but also the organization's health. And, I've seen this firsthand as well. People who I greatly admire, who I see as strong and compassionate leaders, sometimes fall into behaviors that cause a toxic environment because they're struggling. They have either, they've hit that wall, they're fatigued, they're depleted, they're overwhelmed, or they're in over their head. They've taken on a responsibility that they don't necessarily have the capacity to do. And that can have such a significant ripple effect. So I guess my question for you is, what are some effective strategies for leaders, right? Particularly when we're thinking about everything that we're facing in terms of the DEI pushback. What are some effective strategies for building stamina so that we can fight back against that wall, or hopefully avoid it altogether?
Whew, let's see here. Where do I start? um, yeah, one thing that occurred to me as you were just sharing that last bit is that the wall that we've described, we focused a lot about the internal wall that shows up in terms of our fatigue and taking on stuff, but there are external walls also that when we feel we're doing everything right, then suddenly the organization presents a wall that is very, very difficult to go through. And in those instances we just described, where organizations are talking a good game, but then behind the scenes they're doing the opposite, that's almost like walking completely in the dark and running into a wall you didn't even see was there, right? And so I think to kind of answer partly at least your question, leaders need to really set up environments where we are walking the talk, right? There has to be a willingness to really um, work on our emotional intelligence and really continue to ask ourselves, am I showing up as my best self, and am I showing up in ways that are congruence with my stated values. I think we need to create environments where what you just described a moment ago, of folks who are taking on too much, or perhaps are fantastic, phenomenal human beings who suddenly don't show up well because of everything going on in their lives or being overwhelmed, that we create environments where folks can feel okay to admit that they are overwhelmed, admit that they didn't show up well, and be okay with being received and given the opportunity to rectify that, right? I think because that's taking care of the person, right? It's recognizing that we all have limits, and sometimes when we reach a limit, it's not a sign of weakness; it's a sign of reality of life, and that we need to address that. And so I think there are a number of things leaders can do to set up structures and systems and cultures that allow folks to, you know, be their best selves and be okay with admitting when they're not their best selves and asking for help. As individuals, I think a lot of what we can do is to really insist upon taking care of ourselves. And, over and over again, we continue to see that badge of honor of folks working 70, 80-hour weeks. And, the giant international corporate entities that make really cool cars, really, boasting about how their staff needs to work more and can sleep in their offices if they need to, right? So it's this hustle culture that is, toxic, and it's really impacting communities and individuals in really negative ways. And so I think for individuals, it's an insistence that I'm going to take care of myself, that my commitment and my zeal and my dedication to the craft that I'm involved in, to bettering communities, to creating more inclusion, to really being an amplifier and a voice for those who don't have a voice. None of that is taken away because I take time for myself. In fact, by taking time for myself, I am better able to show up in the future and for a long, long time down the road. Too often we see folks jeopardize their health and their well-being and their relationships with family and their relationships with loved ones. And their sense of having ownership and control of the trajectory of their life, because they just feel like they have to completely be all in, or else it's not worth it. And so for me, it starts individually with well-being, knowing what sustains you individually. There are a lot of folks that have a lot of ideas about what good well-being and health means for each of us, and there's some valuable information out there, but ultimately you best, and how you show up and how you take care of yourself is really rooted in what you know about yourself and what sustains you and what brings you life, so you can give life to others.
I'm going to add one thing to that, because yes to everything you just said. And I also think about when it comes to training for an endurance race, it's often it's not necessary, for me at least, doing it completely by myself doesn't work. I need a team. I need a coach. I need people who I'm not going to do all my runs with my team, but having some buddies that I know can be there for me to boost me up, right? To encourage me, to push me out of bed when I don't want to go on that long run. So there's that solidarity as well
The
as that
struggle is real.
accountability, right? And to have somebody who can be there to observe when maybe I am getting off track. I think that is invaluable for us when we think about how to maintain our stamina. Yes, there's work that we all need to do individually, and sometimes that is saying no to something. Sometimes it is taking ourselves out. I'm gonna just rest today, whatever the case may be. But it's also, I think, about building our and tapping into and receiving help from our community.
Yes.
And so I want to make a shameless plug, because starting June 1, registration opens for the next Ember program. And so Ember is an experience, a community that we launched in 2023. We had the initial pilot program in December, and it was just a transformational experience for everybody who participated, including for us as the facilitators of
Absolutely.
that particular event, right? But it's something that it's more than just a training program, although there is that sort of intensive, we're going to come together and spend 3 days in community, learning with and from one another as DEI change agents. But it's also about the ongoing work and support that we can provide, right? That ability to be in community, so we're not so isolated, to provide that peer coaching and that encouragement and that challenge for one another, as practitioners who are sometimes coming into this work from very different vantage points, different lived experiences, different industries. And I think that was one of the things that was so powerful from the pilot episode, the pilot program, was that we had people coming from, we had higher ed, we had public schools, we had government, we had nonprofits, we had corporate. And I think a lot of times we get siloed into thinking, oh, we must do things this way because this is how others in our industry or our sector do it. And folks found so much value in being able to share their ideas and their model practices and kind of take notes from each other. So hopefully people who are interested, if you are looking for that opportunity to build community, if you're looking for an opportunity to refresh and revitalize yourself, if you're looking for an opportunity to take your skills to the next level, all of that is going to be front and center in our upcoming Ember program, which is October 8th through 10th in Denver, Colorado. Just putting it out there. We'll send the website out to people. But you can go to msmglobal.com and register. And of course, reach out to us if you have any questions about the program. Roger, you
Great
participated.
plug.
Yeah, thank you. You participated as a facilitator. So, if you had just kind of an elevator pitch for those folks out there who are doing this work, who are feeling the fatigue, who are hitting up against the wall, why Ember?
Well, your point about community is so important because as we've described in terms of taking care of ourselves and doing what we need to do to really sustain ourselves, we often feel alone in the work. And that is not just a metaphor. It is the reality for quite a few DEI practitioners across sectors. You are a one-person shop quite often. And so talk about feeling isolated, right? And I think the beauty of Ember for me was, we talked about this while we were there, that we suspected that folks would have these aha moments of like, no way, you're dealing with the same thing I'm dealing with, and you work in higher ed and I work in corporate and I work in nonprofit and so forth. Right. And so I think that's what really was the beautiful thing about Ember, is that our work is rooted in the same core principles and values and outcomes that we are seeking, which is more inclusive, more equitable, right, more diverse, more accessible communities that folks can thrive in, can be their best selves in. And that is true for any industry that you're in. And so while the dynamics and the nuances may be a little bit different in terms of the clientele or the people that we serve or who makes up the folks that we connect with within each industry, at the root, we are doing the same work. And that is a beautiful thing. And I think when folks realize that and see and hear the deeply personal stories that people bring to Ember, it is life-giving. And I think that that's what's really wonderful about Ember. And I cannot wait to see Ember continue to grow and folks really take value and, energy from it, because it's really going to be necessary to carry us forward, particularly when we continue to see that pushback happening around our society, right? So if you're thinking about Ember, if you've heard about programs or thought about programs that should have a community focus and not be just like a normal conference that you go to, sign up for Ember. It will be absolutely worth it. And, you could take me at my word for that.
And thank you so much, Roger, for joining me on this journey of the Culture Stew podcast. This season has been phenomenal. I can't wait for season 6. In the meantime, I wanted to also thank our listeners for hanging with us. We hope that you continue to find value in our podcast episodes. And if you do, share it with others. We would love to be able to grow our audience and reach more people as we continue to do this work and try to make it as sustainable as possible. So that is our homework request to you all over the summer. Maybe reach out to 2 or 3 friends, colleagues, family members who you think might benefit from our podcast and share a little bit about the Culture Stew experience. And we hope you have a wonderful, happy summer season, and we'll see you all this fall.
Thank you for listening to Culture Stew. In a world full of podcasts, we are so grateful that you chose to spend time with us today.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Morukian.
And me, Roger Moreano.
Are you interested in learning more about Culture Stew and MSM Global Consulting? Sign up for the Culture Stew newsletter at www.msmglobalconsulting.com and send us your stories or your questions at culturestew at msmglobalconsulting.com.
And remember to please give us a 5-star rating and review on your podcast platform.
See you next time.